Hi everybody, this is Dr. C with week three's lecture. Um, in a moment, I'm going to go into um, something that sort of the tail end of the Enthymeme activity that you had to do for Monday. There you had to produce an enthymeme, and what I'm getting ready to go over is how to take an enthymeme that you've produced, or one that you've sort of derived from an argument that you've encountered, and break it down into what's referred to as its syllogism, so that you can test the validity of the enthymeme and use that sentence itself to be able to determine whether the argument that you're looking at is actually reasonable and sound. So that's a big use or a big benefit of working with enthymemes, which can be kind of difficult. I've mentioned this before, but they often give students fits. So that's something that I thought I would include in this lecture. Uh, I'll cut to that in just a moment. But I do want to start off with kind of an assessment of what I've looked of the assignments that I've looked at thus far. I've gone through some of the um, uh, reading analyses that you had to submit this past weekend, and I've gone through pretty much everything else that you submitted before that reading analysis. So I kind of wanted to stop for a moment and just talk about what I've seen, and to just mention that overall I think we're doing pretty good. I've taught this course a bunch of times, and I like to, around week 2 or 3, kind of take stock of things to figure out whether we're on the right track or not, or if this group of students is kind of where my students normally are with the particular class that I'm teaching. And I think that's all very true right now. I guess this is writing 123, and pretty much I think we're exactly where my students normally are in week 2 or 3 in my writing 123 courses. Um, I think one of uh, I'll just kind of quickly break down a couple of things so that they are clear to some of you who I think are still kind of struggling with certain elements or aspects of this course. The reading analysis, the synthesis essay, those are assignments that are in the essay cycle. They're building up to essay 1. And we've already talked about this, how the essays in this class are arranged in cycles. So they have assignments that sort of lead up to them. And with the reading analysis, the eagle-eyed among you will have noticed that, when you're writing essays, there are some things that you really need to be able to do effectively. You need to be able to summarize effectively. You need to be able to paraphrase effectively. You need to be able to use quotations effectively to move from your ideas to the ideas of others, their exact words. When you summarize or you paraphrase, you're not using the exact words of the original author. What you're doing is you're presenting their ideas in your own words. You're summarizing what they're saying, which means to present it in very compressed form, or you're paraphrasing it, which means to unpack it. Typically, paraphrasing is longer, significantly longer than summary, or you're directly quoting them, giving the exact words that they originally used. Those three things are very connected. That's how we, present ideas that don't belong to us, and frequently we're often actually moving back and forth between summary, paraphrase, and direct quotation very fluidly. Summary for the purposes of this course, you can think of summary as basically, like, when you summarize an argument, what you're doing is presenting its thesis statement. If you are walking us through the entire argument, how it is made, from the beginning of it to the end, that's much more like paraphrasing. Typically speaking, when we paraphrase only sections of an argument, or pages from an argument rather than the whole thing. In the reading analysis that you just did, a couple of things were being tested: your ability to summarize an argument, your ability to paraphrase an entire argument, and your ability to sort of like stay open-minded enough to explore questions that the argument you just encountered, especially its reasoning, might have actually brought to mind as you were encountering that argument or parsing it. So those are the things that were being tested. Some of you, in the way that you did that assignment, it indicates to me that maybe you ought to read your prompts a little bit more closely. Others had a real difficult time sort of reserving judgment and not articulating their own argument in this assignment that really wasn't meant for that. What it was meant to test, basically, is your note-taking skills. Annotation requires summary and paraphrase and the effective use and integration of quoted material. Those skills play into essay writing as well, but really the reading analysis is, and I think I mentioned this before, that reading analysis you just did was basically a gussied up note-taking assignment. It tested your ability to take notes in as neutral and objective a manner as possible. So again, read your prompts more closely. For those of you that really struggled with that dimension of the assignment, that's what that's an indicator of. Is that you need to read your prompts more closely. Or use my office hours to help clarify any questions that you have about your assignments. Now, the first essay cycle, the one that ends with essay 1, the one we're in right now, what that really tests is a couple of sort of like, each assignment sort of tests certain things. And presents you with an opportunity for you to practice those things before you get to the essay at the end of the cycle. The reading analysis, obviously, like I just said, tested your ability to analyze a reading, to take notes on it. The synthesis essay will test your ability to synthesize ideas. And I'll talk about that again in just a minute, but I wanted to kind of make sure that you understood, like, these assignments are sort of building up, right? Scaffolded assignments, that's what that means. So, excuse me. With a synthesis essay that you've got coming up, that's going to test your ability to synthesize. It's also true, though, that there are larger goals that each essay cycle in this class tries to address. The final essay cycle that you're going to be doing is much more focused on research, how to conduct good scholarly research, how to sift through sources, how to keep track of your sources, how to ensure that your argument grows out of your research, how to use that research as support, how to move back and forth between your ideas and the ideas of others effectively, how to determine whether a claim you make needs support. Those are the kinds of things. What kinds of support do you have? Which kinds of support belong where in an essay? Those are the kinds of things that you will be working on with essay 2. For essay 1, our primary focus, the sort of big test with essay 1 is not the integration of research, but rather your ability to synthesize information. So, the synthesis essay that you're getting ready to do is an important step in that direction. Synthesis really requires, and it's kind of a skill. It is a skill, but it's a skill that requires us to think about arguments, not just in like the direct thing that they're saying, but also the implications of the things that they're saying. To think about arguments thematically, to think about the arguments that they're making as whole cloth rather than just looking for a thesis statement and discarding the entire argument. So, for instance, if you go back to that initial, it's the week 2 discussion forum post that you did, where the prompt for that post was basically, how do you define science, how do you define politics, and what connections, if any, do you see between them? And it also asked you to define politics and partisanship, and to explore the ways in which those two concepts intersect and overlap. That is a classic synthesis test. Classic. It's at the same time as it tested your ability to look at two things that seem very disconnected from one another, but actually have a lot in common, or share a lot of concerns, or have a lot of interrelated parts, or are constantly speaking to one another. Science and politics are constantly speaking to one another. Some of you had a real difficult time assessing the connections between the two. Some of you even went the route of trying to combine not the ideas, but rather the terms. Political science, for instance, right? If you're in that camp, what I suggest that you do is go back to that forum and review it, because many of the students in this class are actually fairly good at synthesis, and what they were able to do is say, okay, here's this thing science, and here's this thing politics, and they explored the ways in which those things intersected and overlapped. Classic example of a synthesis test, of a test of your ability to synthesize information. That's to me, science and politics are so interconnected that it's almost impossible to discuss science without including some sort of political dimension. Although it's very easy to discuss politics without including a scientific dimension. But that's me. That's just why I teach the classes, because stuff like this comes fairly easy to me. So, but it's a skill. The more you work on it, the better you get at it. The same goes for yours truly. I was not great at synthesis when I started college. I got better at it as college proceeded. So, I would strongly suggest if you had that difficulty with that assignment, or if it was like, what is he trying to get me to do? I suggest you go back and read the work of your peers in that form. There's a lot of folks that found some really compelling ways in which science and politics are interrelated, and there's another part of that assignment that really I think people maybe didn't. That's a sort of a little bit of a test. It's the synthesis is really important. The ability to be able to look at arguments or look at ideas and see the ways in which they're interconnected and overlap, and to produce, ultimately, to produce your own argument through constant synthesis. We'll talk about that a little bit more in the term later in the term. But it's also really important to be able to engage in what I refer to as the art of fine distinction. Those two things really are elemental to your experience as college students. You will be constantly synthesizing information. That literally is what college is all about. But you also constantly be negotiating fine distinctions, which is also what college is all about. That's what scholarship is. Looking at things and determining the ways in which they are interconnected, and then also being able to look at things that seem very connected to one another and identifying the ways in which they are different from one another. Politics is not partisanship. It is not partisanship. It is expressed through a partisan lens at current in this country. But partisanship is not necessarily politics. Politics includes partisanship, but partisanship doesn't necessarily include politics. A way of that's the quickest, easiest way I have of breaking down the difference between those two terms that seem so interconnected. And to make things even more difficult, they're often expressed as being analogous terms, even though they're not. So what's the lesson there? If you take that synthesis and find art of distinction in that assignment and kind of take them and look at them together, maybe that thinking about science and politics is not necessarily the same as thinking about science and partisanship. And I think some of you identified this, but it was a surprisingly few of you how many of you use this as an example. I think the biggest example of exactly what I'm talking about is standing right in front of us. It's the reason that we're taking this course remotely or online. It's the pandemic. So I think going back and taking a look at the responses that your peers posted in that week 2 discussion forum for many of you would be a highly productive and fruitful activity. It will, for those of you that have difficulty with synthesis or trying to figure out how to synthesize these two terms in this course, it'll give you a lot of ideas. For those of you who are who had a little bit of difficulty sort of splitting politics and partisanship and think of them as being analogous, there were many of your peers that were able to distinguish between those two terms. And finally, for those of you, and this happens in every class that I teach, that are having a difficult time with sort of like with the approach of this course. There are students who take writing classes that just want to be told what to do, and I get that. That's not this class, but I get that. For those of you that are in that camp where you're sort of frustrated because you just want me to tell you what to do, here's an opportunity for you to do exactly that. Go back to that forum, take a look at the notes that the posts of your classmates, and ask yourself if thinking through this material from the bottom up would yield better writing. I think it would. I think it almost always does. So rather than me sitting around and telling you what to do on a grammatical, mechanical, and syntactical level, I ask that you engage with this course as fulsomely as possible. And keep in mind that in any class that you take where writing is required, you're going to have to study something that you're going to write about in this course that is science and politics, or science and culture. The culture of science is what we're referring to in this course. So the ways in which people negotiate scientific information, not just within the field of science, but also outside of science. That might be an easier way of understanding or encapsulating the thrust of sort of the thematics of this course. There's writing, and then there's the thematics. The thing you're looking at that you're going to be writing about, and then the ways in which you write about it. Those two things are very important in any writing class that you take. So for those of you that are struggling with sort of the concept of this course, I hope that clarifies things for you at least a little bit. Okay? So now I'm going to cut to, let's see, I'm going to make sure I don't miss anything. Take a look at my notes. That's the sort of the principles of synthesis. I wanted to review that real fast for you. As you're moving through the readings that I assign, and especially for this first essay cycle, one thing that you can do that would really make things easy for you is to continue taking notes on those readings, and to include in that note-taking process one step where you go through and you say, hey, okay, how are these readings related to one another? and you spitball those ideas on the page, right? Spitball those connections on the page. I think for a lot of you that are struggling with synthesis, that approach would yield benefits. And it would also help you arrive at, yeah, you see how I'm constantly asking y'all to identify questions. That's the hallmark of an inquiry-based approach to written argumentation. In other words, an approach that doesn't start off with, I've got a thesis statement, I'm going to prove it no matter what, but rather starts off with, this source makes me wonder about this. This other source makes me wonder about this. Asking questions and staying as open-minded as possible until you can actually arrive at an argument that you can articulate and defend using the sources that helped you get there, right? So, that's what I wanted to talk about with synthesis. I also want to kind of just give a quick sense of that paragraphing assignment that you have due next week. A lot of you actually have problems with paragraphing, especially with body paragraphing, and this is not atypical at all in Writing 123. Students often come into this class with issues in paragraphing. Some of you are quite good at it, and others of you clearly need some work on your paragraphing. If you go back to your reading analysis, for instance, and you notice that you didn't really attempt an introduction or a conclusion, but you just had a couple of paragraphs, so you tried to do everything all at once. If you go back to it and notice that maybe you had an introduction and a conclusion, but you just had one big paragraph where you were trying to do what the prompt was asking you to do, or you didn't take a look at the prompt, and if you didn't take a look at the prompt and figure out, okay, well, this is what the prompt's asking me to do, here's how I might effectively paragraph it to make it easier for your reader to read. If that's not really the mindset that you have, then paragraphing is probably something you need to pay closer attention to. And I think that if you go to the paragraphing activity that we're doing next week, you'll see the way in which I'm sort of trying to get y'all to start thinking about paragraphing in a different way. When you do that activity, keep in mind, it's a pretty straightforward activity. The explanations, I think the prompt for it, instructions for it are pretty clear. When you do that activity, just keep in mind that it's very, very, very likely that your way of doing it will differ from the ways that your peers do. And there are more ways to complete the activity properly than I can count. In other words, paragraphing is, I would say, almost like 45 to 49% science, and the rest of it is art. Which means, by extension, by the way, that in order for you to get better at paragraphing, you need to know that you need to improve at paragraphing, and you need to adjust your reading practices accordingly so that you can start tackling paragraphing through the observation of how people who are good at writing actually paragraph. We'll talk more about some techniques and strategies that you can use, especially through the identification of what I call firm paragraph breaks or hard paragraph breaks. In other words, places in an essay where paragraph breaks really actually should happen versus places in an essay where paragraph breaks, in order to facilitate reader comprehension, probably should happen. There's places where paragraph breaks have to happen, hard paragraph breaks. And there are places where paragraph breaks probably should happen to facilitate reader comprehension, and those are sort of what I refer to as soft paragraph breaks. So we'll talk about that a little bit later in the term. Right now, what I want to do is click over to the screen video on that Enthymeme thing that I was talking about just a second ago. So hang on a second as I do that. I'll click over to that video. So now that you've done the Enthymeme exercise, here is sort of the rest of that exercise, and this is again, enthymemes are tricky things. They can be difficult for some students to kind of get their arms around. But if you've done the enthymeme exercise, this is what you can do after you create an enthymeme to test the logic, reasonableness, and validity of the enthymeme, which is, in a way, basically what that means is, if you construct enthymemes, the real power of constructing enthymemes is that it allows you to quickly assess the validity of your own argument. In other words, expressing your argument in a single sentence in this way allows you to see if your argument is both persuasive and reasonable, which is the big issue that students often have. When they come up with arguments, their thesis statement might be sound, but their reasoning is somehow off. Or their reasoning is solid, but their thesis statement is disconnected from it. Or something is amiss between the reasoning and the main assertion evident in the argument that they're advancing. So crafting enthymemes is a great way of ensuring that your argument, the one that you're coming up with, is sound. But crafting enthymemes is also, by extension, if you sort of reverse engineer that, they are also a really great way of being able to test the arguments that you encounter. Students often, when I'm sitting down and going through work with them, they often sort of remark on how quickly I move through arguments. And this is part of the reason why. I have a lot of training in this kind of work, and for me, when I look at arguments, the first thing I start doing is assessing the connections between their main assertion and their reasoning. And that's exactly what this activity is meant to help you do. So I'm going to go ahead and get started with it. You'll recognize this enthymeme from the enthymeme exercise and video that you just did and watched, right? So SUVs are a great purchase because they're convenient. I'll review it real fast. Some of this will be refresher for those of you that were paying close attention to the video and did this exercise. So the main assertion here is SUVs are a great purchase. This is basically a thesis statement. If you stopped here and used this as a thesis statement for an argument, you'd be perfectly fine, but of course we're going a little deeper than that, right? So this is the thesis statement. Why are SUVs a great purchase? Because, right, they, meaning SUVs, they refers back to SUVs, right? SUVs and they are the same thing. Because they are convenient. So you have a shared subject here, SUVs here, and I'm trying to figure out how to do this. SUVs here and SUVs here. Sorry about that. You have two different predicates. You have SUVs are a great purchase. A predicate is, for those of you that need a little refresher on this, the subject of a sentence is its main noun, the predicate of a sentence is its main verb, and the words associated with that main verb. So, subject to both clauses here, if you were to take the because out of here, put a period here, and get rid of this, and SUVs are convenient. You see that what you have are two clauses, right? They're two independent clauses. Well, they're two clauses that are connected by the word because, which when you use the word because, which is a subordinating conjunction, that automatically makes that clause not an independent clause, but a dependent clause. If you're a grammar nerd like me, you know exactly what that means. If you're not, then that's okay. The point I'm trying to make is that basically what you have here are two sentences that are linked by the word because, right? Two clauses, independent clauses, that are made into, one of them is made into a dependent clause through the use of the word because, but these are two clauses. They both have a subject and they both have a main verb. The subject here for both clauses is SUVs, but the main verb for each clause is different, as you can see, right? For the first one, for the thesis statement, it is are a great purchase, while for the second one, it is are convenient. So this will become very important in just a second. So the main assertion, thesis statement of this argument is SUVs are a great purchase. Why are they a great purchase? Well, because, right? SUVs are spacious, SUVs are great off-road, and SUVs have great towing packages. Now, reasons are one thing, but making sure that your reasons have something to do with one another is quite another thing. In other words, anyone can come up with a bunch of reasons why something is true, but it takes a bit of skill in thinking and analysis and critical thinking to come up with reasoning why something is true. In other words, reasons that work together in an identifiable way to illustrate why your thesis statement or main assertion is valid and true. And here, what that really means is that your reasons have to have something to do with one another. They have to be connected to one another. As you see here, SUVs are spacious, SUVs are great off-road, and SUVs have great towing packages. The way that I went ahead and summarized these reasons and assessed, really, by summarizing them, all I'm doing is assessing the connections between the reasons and identifying the reasoning, right, that underlies them, is that they're convenient. SUVs are convenient. Spaciousness speaks to convenience. Being good off-road speaks to convenience. Great towing packages speaks to convenience. SUVs are convenient. So the enthymeme is, again, when you take the main assertion, you follow it with the word because. In other words, you set the main assertion in a causal relationship with the essays, with the argument's reasoning, right? That is what the word because means. It means something is in a causal relationship with something else. So SUVs are a great purchase. That's your main assertion in your thesis statement. Why? Because SUVs are convenient, which is your summary of reasons, aka your reasoning, right? I'll go ahead and delete this actually, because in reality, these are your reasons. The summary of reasons is really your reasoning, right? When you take everything together. Sorry for the confusion there. So, Enthymeme, SUVs are a great purchase because they are convenient. Here, I've sort of done the work, some work for you. I've highlighted, right, different parts of this enthymeme. Here's a subject. You see the subject here is in both bold and underlined, and you see that it's repeated here. They is a pronoun referring back to SUVs. SUVs and they are basically the same thing. If you were to replace this they with SUVs, you would see immediately what I'm talking about, right? So you can use, for that second instance of the subject, you can use a pronoun that works like they. So what you have here is a breakdown of the enthymeme on a grammatical level. Subject, subject, right? Shared subject, i.e. the subject of both clauses, is SUVs. The predicate of your main verb, predicate or main verb of the main assertion are a great purchase, right? It's in italics. But you have another predicate that's also in italics. That's the predicate of the second clause of the summary of reasons, are convenient, right? So to make things easier, I refer to this predicate as being predicate 1 and this predicate as being predicate 2, right? P1 and P2. Why is this important? Because to test the enthymeme, what you've got to do is it's basically what you're doing in this stage. I'll explain it very quickly for those of you that have had some training in formal logic or informal logic. You'll recognize this. This is basically a syllogistic breakdown of an enthymeme, essentially identifying the informal logic structure that informs the enthymeme itself. So anything that's a long-winded way, or sort of a lots of words, verbose way of saying something really simple, which is that in order to test the enthymeme, you need to identify the logic within the heart of it. And to do that, it's basically a three-step process. These three sentences that you see, or these three formulations that you see in front of you now, are exactly how you would do that. So the first thing that you would say is anything or anyone, literally you would say that anything or anyone, right, that does predicate 2 does predicate 1. What does that mean? It means that anything or anyone that is convenient is a great purchase, right? Predicate 2, predicate 1. Predicate 2 and predicate 1. So anything or anyone that is convenient, you can change the are to is, you can modify the verb that way, change its number, right? Anything that or anyone that is convenient is a great purchase, right? Boom. The second sentence that follows is subject P2. SUVs are convenient. Subject, which is SUVs, and P2, which is are convenient. SUVs are convenient. Therefore, subject P1. SUVs, subject, SUVs, P1 are a great purchase. So, to test the enthymeme, our enthymeme, what you would do is use this formulation and move through it from 1 to 2 to 3. So anything or anyone that is convenient is a great purchase. Number 2, SUVs are convenient. Therefore, number 3, SUVs are a great purchase. So you can see how that sort of exposes the logic that's within the enthymeme itself if you break it down that way. But you can only break it down that way if you formulate the enthymeme properly. For instance, if you have come up with an enthymeme where your subjects are not shared, then what I've just done, the way I've just broken down the enthymeme, would be pretty difficult to do. It'd be actually impossible to do. So that's a big part of the reason why I'm so specific in the way that I ask you to structure and put together your enthymemes, is that if you put them together properly, it makes it easier for you to assess the validity of your own argument. If you don't, it makes it tougher. So one thing that I would suggest that you do is you go back to your own enthymeme and make sure that it's built properly. If you do so and you make sure that it's built properly and it is built properly before you get into this enthymeme testing, then this would really help you identify any flaws in your thinking or in your argument. It also, if you were using this activity and sort of reverse engineering it and using it to, like let's say instead of identifying a thesis statement from an argument that you encounter, you instead try to identify its enthymeme. In other words, you're more not just concerned with what the thing is arguing, but also how it's arguing, what its reasoning is, right? And trying to put all of that into a single sentence. If you're able to do that and do it properly, then you can actually determine whether the piece that you're looking at has a solid, reasonable, and justifiable argument. So enthymeme, in other words, enthymeme testing goes in more than one direction. You can use it for both reading and for your own writing, right? But you have to put together an enthymeme that actually is soundly, or sort of its fundamentals are right. Otherwise, it's really difficult to use this syllogistic breakdown, which is what this is, to test the validity of your enthymemes. Now remember, these are steps that you move through to test your enthymeme. So you got to start off with 1 before you go to 2, before you go to 3. And in between 2 and 3, there's a therefore, right? So you've got a major premise, a minor premise, and a conclusion. For those of you that are skilled with syllogisms or have had some exposure to them in the past, you will recognize that's what this is. The first part of this test is the identification of the major premise. The identification of the minor premise is the second step here, and then the conclusion that you draw from those two premises is what you have for step number 3. Okay? So that's that for the sort of second step or second stage of this enthymeme work that we're doing, aka how to actually test the enthymemes that you come up with. Okay, so that's it for this week's lecture. Next week's lecture will include a section on how to take the work that you've been doing on enthymemes and use it to help sort of interrogate and improve the way in which you have likely been structuring your argumentative essays up to this point. In other words, there's a way of taking the work that we've been doing on enthymemes, which is, again, meant to help you kind of clarify your reasoning and clarify your argumentation, as well as help you become a better critical reader by being able to assess whether the arguments you encounter are logically sound, valid, reasonable arguments, right? Those 3 statements in that syllogism / test of your enthymeme, the major premise, the minor premise, and the conclusion, each one of those works together, right? If the major premise is reasonable, if you read it and you're like, okay, that's a reasonable statement, and the minor premise follows from that major premise, and both are reasonable, then clearly the conclusion that you draw based on that major and minor premise would then be reasonable. So that, again, is how you can probably best conceptualize that enthymeme test, the production of enthymemes, and that test, the video that helps you, develop an enthymeme, as well as what I've just gone over in terms of being able to test it. You can take those two together, and what I'm talking about right now, maybe in a little bit of a confused fashion, should make sense, right? Producing your enthymeme and then testing its logic and validity and reasonableness. So, next week's video will include a section where you will be able to use enthymemes and this enthymeme activity that we've been engaged in to help, hopefully, improve the quality of the arguments that you produce. So the stuff that you're doing for Essay 1 and Essay 2, right? Argumentative essays. Hopefully, what I go over, have gone over, and will go over next week will help you have a stronger sense of essay structure, as well as how you can sort of map the argument that you're making, including its reasoning, to the structure of an argumentative essay. Okay, that's it for now. I'll see you again next week with next week's lecture. Thanks, y'all. Bye.